Hello everyone. Today in the subject of industrial biotechnology, we are going to study about World Trade Organization. So the main objective is to give you more an introduction about World Trade Organization and how understanding of such an organization is helpful in operating uh, under industrial biotechnology. So let's start. What is WTO? Okay, but we should also understand the uh, reasons behind the WTA formation and the operations in which it operates very nicely, and what are the advantages of this very particular organization. World Trade Organization (WTO) is the only global international organization dealing with rules of trade between nations. At its heart are the WTO agreements, negotiated and signed by the bulk of world's trading nations and ratified in their parliaments. The goal is to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers conduct their businesses. So it is an international organization which has been designed or made in order to run the trade between the nations smoothly, right? So agreements are made uh, in between the nations and signed for bulk trade uh, opportunities in between the nations, and changes are made according to the parliaments. And the goal is to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers to conduct their businesses. So, what WTO is doing is to bring together all the nations that have exporting capacity, those have importing capacity, those can readily provide very good goods and services, and who can export their goods, and those who can purchase the goods. There are a number of ways of looking at the World Trade Organization. It is an organization for trade opening. It is the forum for government to negotiate trade agreements. It is a place for them to settle trade disputes. It operates a system of trade rules. Essentially, the WTO is a place where members of government try to sort out their trade problems they face with each other. So, in simple words, you can say that WTO is a platform where all the nations they negotiate with each other freely without any foundation. And what are the problems they are facing with the trading capacities and trading options, and how they can be readily solved without any government interventions, right? So there are a number of ways of looking at World Trade Organization. So one side of the people can also say it is a monopoly of the uh, great trading nations. Okay, it is an organization for trade opening. Some say that, and it is a forum for governments to negotiate trade agreements. And it is open. On the other hand, it is also an open forum where different nations can get together and discuss their trade agreements. So it is also a very good place to settle down the trade disputes that arises in between the countries regarding to their excise duty or any other thing. The WTO is run by its member governments. All major decisions are made by the membership as a whole, either by ministers who usually meet at least once every 2 years, or by their ambassadors or delegates who meet regularly in Geneva. So they do have an organized structures. They do have an organized body, and their representatives, they do meet each other regularly in order to convey the information and to maintain a constant communication. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO, is the international organization whose primary purpose is to open trade for benefit of all. So it benefits all. This organization try to upbring the situation of every country and those who are included in the World Trade Organization. So it is also upbringing their trade potential, and it is a very good learning platform for those countries also who do not have a very strong economy, or they do not have any strong trading system. The WTO agreements are lengthy and complex because they are legal text covering a wide range of activity. So the documents that are being signed at World Trade Organizations are generally very lengthy, and they do cover a lot of legal text and legal issues. So because of these wide range of activities, their documents are very lengthy. But a number of simple fundamental principles run throughout all these documents. So, but their main motto, if you summarize their documents, their lengthy documents, is the same in overall scenario. And what are those things? These principles are the foundation of a multilateral trading system. So these efforts are made to develop this multilateral trading system. Right, their overall scenario is to develop the trade relationship in between the countries all around the world. The World Trade Organization is a non-governmental organization that regulates and facilitates international trade between nations. So this body regularly operates in between the governments and facilitating and developing and encouraging the trade relation in between the nations. Government use the organization to establish, revise, and enforce the rules that govern international trades. So most of the time, it is very beneficial for the country's economy, so that they can develop a new trade relationship with the other countries. And it officially commenced operation on 1st January 1995, uh, pursuant to the 1994 Marrakesh Agreement, thus replacing the government agreement on traffics and trades (GTTA) that had established in 1948. The WTO is the world's largest international economic organization with 164 member states representing over 96% of global trade and global GDP. The WTO facilitates trades in goods, services, and intellectual property among participating countries by providing a framework for negotiating trade agreements, which usually aim to reduce or eliminate uh, tariffs, quotas, and other restrictions. These agreements are signed by representatives of members' government and ratified by their legislatures. So this body has been formed in order to carry out the trading in between the countries without any restriction, and it is a body of 164 members, and it controls 96% of the global GDP. So being a member of this organization is really very helpful in order to enhance and increase the trading relationship, and it will also contribute a lot towards the enhancement of the nation's economy as the trade will increase without any restriction. That very particular country will get a lot of foreign currency also that will be beneficial for their development. The WTO also administers independent dispute resolution by enforcing participants' adherence to trade agreements and resolving trade-related disputes. So, WTO also serves as a common platform for independent dispute resolution. So, the countries, those who are having disputes regarding to uh, some problems or agreements of trade, these this body always try to resolve the trade disputes that arises in between the countries. So it is also very safe and secure platform to work together. The organization prohibits discrimination between trading partners but provides exceptions for environmental protection, national security, and other important goals. So, in the long term, if we see that this organization is not at all partial, okay, it is a very justified organization which does not discriminate between its trading partners, but provide exceptional cases for and a special security for environmental protection, national security, and important goals are of utmost importance. So these organization or this organization, they do have some principles and it does not compromise with it. The WTO headquartered is in Geneva, Switzerland. Its top decision-making body is Ministerial Conference, which is composed of all member states and usually uh, convenes biannually. Consensus is emphasized in all decisions. So ministerial conference are the topmost ranking people, and they do emphasize rules and regulations on all decisions that are being made. Day-to-day functions are handled by General Council, made up of representatives from all members. A secretariat over 600 personnel, led by Director General and four deputies, provides administrative, professionals, and technical services. The WTO annual budget is roughly 220 million US dollars, which is contributed by members based on their proportion of international trade. So, the more proportion you cover international trade, the more what do you say, more space you will have at WTO, or you will have a better voice at WTO. The amount of trade you are conducting, more your voice will be heard. Studies show that WTO has boosted trade and reduced trade barriers. It has also influenced trade agreements. Generally, 2017 analysis found that the vast majority of preferential trade agreements (PTAs) up to that point explicitly reference the WTO, with substantial portion of text copied from WTO agreements. Goal 10 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals also referenced WTO agreements as instruments of reducing inequality. However, critics contended that the benefits of WTO facilitated free trade are not shared equally, citing the outcomes of negotiation and data showing a continually widening gap between rich and poor nations. So, WTO is also working hard in order to help the nations that are not that much economically sound. and it also enhanced the negotiation and terms, and continually it is working on to bridge the gap between rich and poor nations. So its analysis and its goal is to enhance and advertise the trading options and trading facilities to every country. So, uh, but the critics contend the benefits of WTO facilitate free trade are not shared equally. So, critics say that the WTO is facilitated by the rich countries, and they do not favor poor countries equally, citing the outcomes of negotiation and data showing a continually widening gap between rich and poor nations. So critics are constantly saying that your policies is widening the gap between rich and poor nations. Everyone is not getting benefited equally. So WTO, the precursor of General Agreement on Preface and Trade, Preface and Trade, was established by a multilateral treaty of 23 countries in 1947 after World War II, in the wake of other new multilateral institutions dedicated to international economic cooperation, such as World Bank founded in 1944 and International Monetary Fund founded in 1944 or 1945. So these are the three bodies that were formed simultaneously in order to help the condition of many countries that were recovering from the Second World War and the damage caused by it. A comparable international institution for trade, named the International Trade Organization, never started as the US and other signatories did not ratify the Establishment Treaty, so GATT slowly became a de facto international organization. So there were also efforts to establish a new organization for international trade, but it was never supported by US and its allies. So it became a de facto international organization. GATT negotiations before Uruguay. Several rounds of negotiation occurred under GATT uh, during 1949 to 1979. The first GA real GATT trade round 1947 to 1960 concentrated on further reducing tariffs. Then the Kennedy round in mid-60s brought about a GATT anti-dumping agreement and a section on development. The Tokyo round during the 70s represented the first major attempt to tackle the trade barriers that do not take form of tariffs and to improve the system, adopting a series of agreements and non-tariff barriers, which in some cases interpreted existing GATT rules, and in others broke entirely new ground. Because not all GATT members accepted these plurilateral agreements, they were often informally called codes. The Uruguay Round amended several of these codes and turned them into multilateral commitments accepted by all WTO members. Only four remained plurilateral: those on government procurement, bovine meat, civil aircraft, and dairy products. But in 1997, WTO members agreed to terminate the bovine meat and dairy agreements, leaving only two. Despite attempts in mid 50s and 60s, to establish some of the institutional mechanisms for international trade. The GATT continued to operate for almost half a century as semi-institutionalized multilateral treaty regime on provisional basis. Uruguay Round 1986 to 1994. Well before GATT's 40th anniversary, its member concluded that GATT system was straining to adapt to a new globalizing world economy. In response to the problems identified in 1982 Ministerial Declaration, structural deficiency, spillover impacts of certain countries, policies on world trade, GATT could not manage, etc. The eighth GATT round, known as the Uruguay Round, was launched in September 1986 in Punta del Este, Uruguay. It was the biggest negotiating a mandate on trade ever agreed. The talks aimed to extend the trading system into several new areas, notably trade in services and intellectual property, and to reform trade in the sensitive sectors of agriculture and textile. All the original GATT articles were up for review. The final act of concluding the Uruguay round and officially establishing the WTO regime was signed in 15th April 1994 during the ministerial meeting at Marrakesh, Morocco, and hence is known as Marrakesh Agreement. The GATT still exists as the WTO's umbrella treaty for trade in goods, update as a result of Uruguay Round negotiations. A distinction is made between GATT 1994 and updated parts of GATT, and GATT 1947, the original agreement, which is still the heart of GATT 1994. So their agreements have been constantly being renewed and constantly being upgraded and amended, so they can readily adjust with the changing world economic conditions and globalization of international economy. So these organizations are constantly upgrading themselves according to the trade conditions that are present nowadays. GATT 1994 is not, however, the only legally binding agreement, including via the final act at Marrakesh. A long list of about 60 agreements, annexes, decisions, and understanding was adopted. The agreement falls into six main parts. And what are those parts? The agreement establishing the WTO, the multilateral agreements on trade in goods, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, the Agreement on Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, dispute settlement, reviews of government trade policies. In terms of WTO's principle relating to tariff ceiling binding number 3, the Uruguay round has been successful in increasing binding commitments by both developed and developing countries, as may be seen in percentage of traffic bound before and after 1986 and 1994 talks. Ministerial Conferences. The highest decision-making body of WTO, the Ministerial Conference, usually meets after every 2 years. It brings together all members of WTO, all of which are countries or custom unions. The Ministerial conference can take decisions on matters under any of the multilateral trade agreements. Some meetings, such as the inaugural Ministerial Conference in Singapore and Cancun Conference in 2003, which involved arguments between developed and developing economies referred to as Singapore issues, such as agricultural subsidies, while others, such as the Seattle Conference in 1999, provoked large demonstrations. The Fourth Ministerial Conference in Doha in 2001 approved China's entry to the WTO and launched the Doha Development Round, which was supplemented by the Sixth WTO Ministerial Conference in Hong Kong, which agreed to phase out agricultural export subsidies and to adopt European Union's Everything But Arms initiative to phase out tariffs for goods from the least developed countries. At the Sixth WTO Ministerial Conference of 2005 in December, WTO launched the Aid for Trade initiative and is especially to assist developing countries in trade as included in Substantial Development Goal 8, which is to increase aid for trade support and economic growth. The 12th Ministerial Conference (MC12) was uh, due to be held in Nur Sultan, Kazakhstan in June 2020 but was cancelled because of COVID-19 pandemic. Doha Round Doha Agenda 2001 to present situation. The WTO, the current round of negotiation, the Doha Development Round, at the Fourth Ministerial Conference in Doha, Qatar, in November 2001. This was to be an ambitious effort to make globalization more inclusive and help the world's poor, particularly by slashing barriers and subsidies in farming. The initial agenda comprised both further trade liberalization and new rule-making, uh, underpinned by commitments to strengthen substantial assistance to developing countries. Progress stalled over differences between developed nations and the major developing countries on issues such as industrial tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade, particularly against and between the uh, European Union and the US, over the maintenance of agriculture subsidies seem to operate effectively as trade barriers. Repeated attempts to revive the talks proved unsuccessful. Through the adoption of the Bali Ministerial Declaration in 2013, addressed bureaucratic barriers to commerce. As of June 2012, uh, the future of Doha Round remained uncertain. The work program lists 21 subjects in which the original deadline of 1st January 2005 was missed, and the round remains incomplete. The conflict between free trade on industrial goods and services, but retention and uh, protectiono- protectionism on farm subsidies to domestic agriculture sector requested by developed countries, and substantiation of fair trade on agricultural products requested by developing countries remain the major obstacle. The impasse has made it impossible to launch new WTO negotiations beyond the Doha Developmental Round. As a result, there may have been an increasing number of bilateral free trade agreements between governments. As of July 2012, there were various negotiation groups in the WTO system for the current settlement and stalemated agriculture trade negotiations functions. So, among the various functions of WTO, there are these are regarded by analysts as the most important. It oversees the implementation, administration, and operation of the covered agreements, with exception is that it does not enforce any agreement when China came into WTO in December 2001. It provides for a forum for negotiation and for settling disputes. Additionally, it is WTO's duty to review and propagate the national trade policies and to ensure the coherence and transparency of trade policies through surveillance in global economic policymaking. Another priority of the WTO is assistance of developing, least developed, and low income countries in transition to just WTO rules and disciplines through the technical cooperation and training. The WTO shall facilitate the implementation, administration, and operation, and further the objective of this agreement and the multilateral trade agreements shall also provide the framework for the implementation, administration, and cooperation of multilateral trade agreements. The WTO shall provide the forum for negotiations among its members concerning their multilateral trade relations in matters dealt with under the agreement in annexes to this agreement. The WTO shall administer the understanding on rules and procedures governing the settlement of disputes. The WTO shall administer a trade uh, policy review mechanism to achieve greater coherence in global economic policymaking. The WTO shall cooperate as appropriate with International Monetary Fund (IMF) and with the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development (IBRD) and its affiliated agencies. So the above five listings are the additional functions of World Trade Organization. As globalization proceeds in today's society, it is the necessity of an international organization to manage the trading system has been of vital importance. As the trade volume increases, issues such as protectionism, trade barriers, subsidies, violation of intellectual properties arise due to the difference in trading rules of every nation. The trade organization serves as the mediator between the nations when such problems arise. WTO could be referred to as the product for globalization and also as one of the most important organizations in today's globalized society. The WTO is also a center for economic research and analysis. Regular assessment of the global trade picture in its annual publications and research reports on specific topics are produced by the organization. Finally, the WTO cooperates closely with the two other components of Bretton Woods system, the IMF and the World Bank. So, principles of the trading system. WTO establishes a framework of the trade policies. It does not define or specify the outcomes. That is concerned with setting rules of trade policy. Five principles are of particular importance in understanding both pre 1994 GATT and the WTO. The first is non discrimination. It has two major components: the most favored nation MFN rule and the national treatment policy. Both are embedded in the main WTO rules on goods, services, and intellectual property, but their precise scope and nature differ across these areas. The MFN rule requires that the WTO members uh, must apply the same condition on all trade with other WTO members. That is, a WTO member has to grant the most favorable conditions under which it allows trade in a certain product type to all other WTO members. Grant someone a special favor, and you have to do the same for all other WTO members. National treatment means that imported goods should be treated no less uh, favorably than domestically produced goods, at least after the foreign goods have entered the market and was introduced to tackle non-tariff barriers to trade, for example, technical standards, security standards, and discriminating against imported goods. Reciprocity. It reflects both a desire to limit the scope of free riding that may arise because of MFN rule and a desire to obtain better access to foreign markets. A related point is that for a nation to negotiate, it is necessary that the gain from doing so be greater than the gain available from unilateral liberalization. Reciprocal concession intended to ensure that such gains will materialize. Binding the enforceable commitments. The tariff commitments made by WTO members in multilateral trade negotiations and on accession are enumerated in a schedule list of concessions. The schedule established ceiling buildings. A country can be changed. Country can change its building, but only after negotiating with its trading partners, which means compensating them for loss of trade. If satisfaction is obtained, the complaining country may invoke WTO dispute settlement procedures. Transparency. The WTO members requires to publish their trade regulations to maintain institutions, allowing for the review of administrative decisions affecting trade, to respond to requests for information by other members, and to notify changes in trade policies to the WTO. These internal transparency requirements are supplemented and facilitated by periodic country-specific reports that include trade policy reviews through the Trade Policy Review Mechanism (TPRM). The World Trade System tries also to improve predictability and stability, discouraging the use of quotas and other measures used to set limits on quantities of imports. Safety values. In specific circumstances, governments are able to restrict trade. The WTO agreements permits members to make measures to protect not only the environment but also the public health and animal health and plant health. There are three types of provisions in this direction. Article allowing for the use of trade measures to attain non-economic objectives. Articles aimed at ensuring fair competitions. Members must not use environmental protection measures as means of disguising protectionist policies. Provisions permitting interventions in trade for economic areas or economic regions. Exceptions of FN, MFN principle also allows for preferential treatment of developing countries, regional trade, free trade areas, and custom unions. Organizational structure. The highest authority of WTO is the Ministerial Conference, which must meet at least every 2 years. In between each ministerial conference, the daily work is handled by three bodies whose membership is the same. They only differ by the terms of reference under which each body is constituted: the General Council, the Dispute Settlement Body, the Trade Policy Review Body. The General Council, whose chair as of 2020, David Walker of New Zealand, has the following subsidiary bodies which oversees committees in different areas: Council for Trade in Goods. There are 11 committees under the jurisdiction of Goods Council, each with a specific task. All members of the WTO participate in the committees. The textile monitoring body is separate from the other committees, but still under the jurisdiction of the Good Council. The body has its chairman and only 10 members. The body also has several groups relating to textile, council for trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, information on intellectual property in WTO news and official records uh, of the activities of TRIPS Council, and details of the WTO's work with the international organization in the field. Council for Trade Services. The Council for Trade in Services operates under guidance of the General Council and is responsible for oversees the functioning of GATS. It is open to all WTO members and can create subsidiary bodies as required. Trade Negotiations Committee. The Trade Negotiations Committee (TNC) is the committee that deals with the current trade talks round. The chair is WTO Director General. As of June 2012, the committee was tasked with the Doha Development Round. The Service Council has three subsidiary bodies: Financial Services, Domestic Services, GATS rules, and specific commitment. The Council has several different committees, working groups, and working parties. There are several committees on the following: Trade and Environment, Trade and Development, subcommittees on least developed countries, regional trade agreements, balance of payments, restrictions and budgets, finance and administration. There are working parties on following: Association, Accession. There are working groups on the following: trade, debt and finance, and trade and technology transfer. The impact. The study shows that WTO boosted trade. Research shows that in absence of WTO, the average country would face an increase in tariffs on their exports by 32% points. This dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO is one way in which trade is increased. According to a 2017 study in Journal of International Economic Law, nearly all recent preferential trade agreements (PTAs) reference to WTO explicitly, often dozens of times across multiple chapters. Likewise, in many of these PTAs, we find that substantial portion of treaty language, sometimes the majority of a chapter, is copied from a verbatim form of our WTO agreement. The presence of The WTO in PTAs has increased over time. So these are the MCQs. Patent application can be filed in India by all the above. Patent application contains both Form A and Form 2. Complete specification contains all the above. If you file provisional specification, the complete specification is required to be filed within 12 months. Indian patent system has both A and B, pre-grant opposition, post-grant opposition. Pre-grant opposition can be filed by any person. Patent can be revoked in India, yes, in some cases. Working of patent is required in India, yes. Patent of addition can be filed by both A and B, inventor and patentee. Uh, and patent can be infringed by directly and indirectly, both. And these are the references from where we have collected the material. And thank you very much for listening to my lecture.